Well, it looks as if enough people have subscribed to this channel to justify starting up a Patreon. Firstly, thank you very much. Secondly, the link is down below. And thirdly, to be honest, I felt a little bit guilty about blowing up people's inboxes just for a Patreon announcement, so I decided to use this space to answer back on some of the criticisms that my videos have received so far. Not that this is all shade or anything. The reality is that while I've received a lot of great positive feedback and had some interesting discussions with people who are actually formally educated on these topics, the more impassioned criticisms of the ideas presented have unfortunately been little more than your bog standard Republican whinging and a handful of libertarian talking points that have already been debunked. But some of them at least provided me with an opportunity to dig a little deeper on these topics in a way that I think my subscribers would actually be interested in. Going forward, I may do more of these follow-up videos in between my regular content if there's a need for it. One of the bad faith justifications that I received from people trying to defend the fabricated role of small businesses as major job creators was that they existed as hiring pools for larger companies. This is a pretty obvious dodge, since that would still make large companies better job creators, seeing as how they'd be hiring both from those small businesses and also from outside of them. I suppose that one could argue, if they had any evidence, that employees are somehow being groomed through being hired on to multiple smaller companies in a row, and them being hired onto larger companies as a result of that work experience. But I simply have not found anything to suggest that this is somehow a strategy, even unintentionally, for large companies. Basically, while a single individual may have a work experience that looks like this, no one at the top seems to be trying to create other employees like them, or even looking for employees exactly like them. Maybe this is a common feature of some particular jobs in some particular fields, but they do not seem to represent any broader hiring practices. This also, conveniently, ignores all of the other points about how much more exploitation exists among small businesses. Even if we were to claim that small businesses are useful first job creators, they're not, then apparently we're meant to be okay with some of our most vulnerable workers being treated like garbage. That's a pretty awful argument. I did also want to take a moment to go over the details of what employment actually looks like at different firm sizes by the numbers. As you can see here, the overwhelming majority of small businesses are non-employer firms. That means that they don't hire anyone at all. By the way, when I say that small businesses are bad job creators and mostly doomed to failure, I'm talking about their market value. I'm talking about how they operate within a capitalist framework. That does not mean that they're not vital to the industries that they operate within. It's probably the opposite. Among those non-employer firms, one of the highest individual numbers of them was in professional, scientific, and technical services. These are important activities, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of these roles are being performed by specialists. That is exactly the kind of work that needs to be stabilized by removing it from the demands of a profit incentive. For now, that would mean hiring these people into the public sector. Here's a big one. A lot of people came out to defend private corporations by claiming that the research and development activities that they performed were roughly equal to the ones that the public sector performed. This is absolute bunk. Although I understand why people think this way because, hey, that's what all the propaganda says. Also because private-public partnerships are common in R&D, and so some of that activity is necessarily mixed. But it's not nearly as confusing of a topic as it seems to be. We can, quite decisively, see that private investment in research is less effective and less valuable than public investment in the same. In other words, corporations still suck at this. Firstly, let's go ahead and define some terms here. There are three types of research and development. Basic research is just research that gives us a better understanding of the science of a topic, but not necessarily its commercial applications. For example, this might be like doing a study on how car crashes impact the human body. Applied research is how we discover how to turn that basic research into actual products. So, taking that car crash research and using it to invent the concept of a seatbelt. And then there's development, which is how we figure out how to get money from people in exchange for those products. Development has a lot of crossover with marketing, naturally, and also deals a lot with patents. It can be as important as coming up with a public safety campaign which explains the need for seatbelts, or as trivial as figuring out which colors of belts are the least expensive to produce. And while it's often not included in the actual numbers for development, it can include destroying research on better seatbelts by abusing the patent system to crush competition and stifle real innovation. From the Washington Post, a new paper, Does Patent Licensing Mean Innovation?, dispels what doubt there may have been about the innovation value of patents. They analyze the experience of real companies to see how often patent licenses actually spur innovation or technology transfer when patent holders assert their patents against companies. They found that almost no new innovation resulted. When patents were licensed, regardless of whether they were licensed from companies, patent trolls, or universities, they were practically worthless in enabling innovation. They learned that when patent holders approached companies to demand they obtain a license, even if the companies agreed to do this, it rarely led to any new products or other markers of innovation, including transfers of technology or of personnel and joint ventures. Most companies simply paid for the freedom to keep doing what they were already doing with technology that they had independently developed. Non-practicing entities, MPEs, are companies that buy patents in order to obtain licensing fees from others. They have become notorious for being like a modern-day mafia that extorts fees from innovators. The commonly offered justification for MPEs is that they serve as efficient middlemen by bringing new technology from inventors to those who can implement it. Not surprisingly, Feldman and Limley confirmed that they don't do that. The technologies that they license, in the instances that they are able to extort licensing fees from companies, are almost never used in any new or existing products. It isn't just the NPEs that are a problem. The results were the same when the licensing requests or lawsuits came from product-producing companies and universities. The research shows that licensing in response to patent demands is not serving much of an innovation promotion function at all, no matter what type of party initiates the licensing demand. It casts significant doubt on a common justification for a large slice of patent activity. Development, the least useful activity, is also by far the one most practiced by private corporations. From the Atlantic Council, for decades, tech innovation has been the secret sauce in U.S. economic prosperity and global performance. Much of it, including the Manhattan Project, Project Corona, and satellite reconnaissance, grew from federal R&D funding for basic research. However, all such game-changing technologies took multiple learning through experimentation trials, otherwise known as learning from failure, and were the result of basic research funding and the strategic patience of U.S. federal R&D spending. Now, only 17% of U.S. R&D spending is in basic research, and 40% of that is federally funded. Federal R&D spending has fallen to just over 0.6% of GDP, the lowest level since the Sputnik era, and far below the peak period it inspired, which reached above 1.8%. The good news is that private sector R&D is booming, reaching nearly 70% of the U.S. total spending in 2018. Still, though, the bulk of private R&D spending, 78%, is on applied development instead of basic research. In other words, aimed at commercial success in a 2 to 3 year time frame. Business, necessarily focused on the bottom line, fears that basic research breakthroughs might be taken advantage of by competitors. However, this is an even more complicated issue than it seems. Also, from the Atlantic Council, the internet has accelerated the global diffusion of new technologies. It took more than 25 years for 50% of U.S. households to adopt the washing machine. Personal computers took about 18 years to be adopted by 50% of households. Cell phones took about 10 years. Tablet devices, 6 years. On one hand, this means commercialization, if successful, can go global much faster than ever before. On the other hand, with the rapid diffusion of new technologies, innovators in other countries can remix any new device or development and come up with something better fast. This means any long-term R&D effort risks being out of date by the time it is done. The lifespan of the competitive advantage afforded to a nation or company by investing in blue sky research seems to be getting shorter. and shorter. Lastly, in open societies, it is unclear whether national spending translates into competitive advantage. Employees who develop breakthrough ideas can simply be offered higher salaries or better stock options to work somewhere else. Yes, intellectual property laws exist, but with the right lab setup and funding, star researchers can take their ideas one level higher, working around any strong intellectual property protections. This would seem to create a private sector in which patent trolling and the ability to legally abuse existing intellectual property laws while skirting them when they apply to your own company is rewarded. Even without the arguments around patents, we can see that as federal funding for R&D has decreased and the private sector has taken over, these research activities have become less effective and less valuable. Reading now from a report by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. While business R&D investment in the United States jumped by two-thirds on an inflation-adjusted basis from $328 billion in 2000 to $458 billion in 2016, the rate of R&D growth as a share of GDP over the same period has been anemic, inching up from 2.61% to 2.74%. Moreover, businesses are investing a much smaller share of their revenues in riskier early-stage basic and applied research than in later-stage development, and the global share of business R&D performed in the United States has fallen significantly in the last decade. In order for the United States to continue expanding its innovation economy, it must enact stronger policies that support both business R&D, such as more generous R&D-specific tax incentives and expansion of the science, technology, engineering, and math workforce, and federal R&D, as every dollar of federal R&D spurs an additional 30 cents in business R&D. Now, personally, I don't agree with the takeaway that a mixed R&D approach which uses tax incentives to pressure the private sector into actually doing something useful is the best approach, based on all of the other evidence that I'm bringing up here. But that last sentence from that quote does bring up an interesting and often undiscussed feature of government spending on R&D, the so-called crowd-in effect, in which the private sector will invest more so long as the public sector is first leading the way. If the government wants it, then private companies are more likely to want it too. However, I do want to address some of the potential nuances within that idea as well. In looking over various academic papers for this video, I stumbled upon some research by a Cal Poly student named Sebastian Hamarani. Government in the US of every level spent $65.7 billion, real $2005 on R&D projects in 2014. About 16% of all R&D funds that year. As R&D work is crucial to economic growth, the relationship between these and private funds is important. This paper finds the nature of that relationship depends on the type of R&D spending and what level of government makes the expenditure, a distinction not explored in the existing literature. Specifically, state and local funds are complementary to private funds, while federal funds exhibit a more mixed relationship. These results are insightful, but pose several questions. First, why are state and local funds complementary with private funds, but federal funds are not? As noted, most of these funds go to R&D work in public universities. These institutions exhibit documented R&D spillover effects with private industry that may explain the observed relationship. However, further research is necessary to confirm this mechanism is at work. Second, would further divisions in the type of federal R&D spending demonstrate different relationships? The numerous departments of the federal government conduct a spectrum of R&D activities, ranging from basic research to missile defense development. Individually, some of these may not result in the substitution effect the aggregate results display. Finally, the question of why microeconomic and macroeconomic studies on this issue diverge remains. It would be interesting for future research to why these approaches give different results when evaluating the critical issue of R&D funding. Feel free to read that one for yourself. It's certainly not exhaustive. No one paper really can be on a topic this broad, but it does provide some intriguing questions about the nature of this private-public relationship based on where need is really concentrated. By the way, since military funding was brought up in there, I think it's also worth answering the questions some people brought up about Department of Defense spending. Firstly, yes, the DoD does take the lion's share of R&D money for the US government, as you can see here. By the way, keep this chart handy in case anyone tries to tell you that NASA or the Department of Education are somehow overfunded. The natural counter-argument to the DoD issue is, of course, that civilian products often come from military research. Duct tape, aerosol bug spray, and, the whole freaking internet. Oh, and GPS. But surely that doesn't mean that funding the DoD is the only way to get these kinds of results. After all, a great deal of R&D is done in universities, but the Department of Education is never a top priority. Well, Elizabeth Warren has some choice words on why that imbalance might exist. In 2018 alone, the top 20 defense contractors hired 645 former senior government officials, top military brass, members of Congress, and senior legislative staff as lobbyists, board members, or senior executives. 90% of these former officials became registered lobbyists. In other words, if you think that the government isn't spending its research money wisely, then corporations are still to blame. Because it makes no sense to blame the roosters when the fox gets into the henhouse, especially when the farmer keeps defunding the fences because he's convinced the horses that this will benefit them through tax cuts. I think that analogy may have gotten away from me some. Anyways, I want to get back to that ITIF report. Businesses invest in R&D to develop advantages over their competition and to maximize the returns on their investments. But R&D investments generate knowledge spillovers that can benefit competitors. Since private industry cannot capture the full social benefits of R&D investments, companies underinvest in R&D. In fact, actual private R&D investment is 2 to 4 times less than the amount needed to maximize U.S. economic welfare. Public R&D investment corrects the market failure of private markets underinvesting in R&D because businesses cannot capture the social benefits of R&D. Businesses that receive federal R&D investments can attract further private R&D investments, as federal R&D grants have strict evaluation processes that private investors can use as good indicators of a company's potential. For example, according to economist Sabrina Howell, companies that receive Small Business Innovation Research Awards doubled their chances of receiving venture capital later. This might be why, adjusted for inflation, businesses in 2014 invested as much in basic and applied research as they did in 2000. In other words, again, the private sector does not care nearly as much about real research as it does about development, a process which is often the enemy of innovation. And again, we see that the reason for this is an inability for the private sector to both accomplish its goals and fund innovation. Economic studies and aggregated metrics suggest the productivity of R&D investments has gone down in recent years. An example of one such metric reflecting this trend is the number of corporate patents granted per $1 million invested in developmental research. From 1995 to 2009, every $1 million in developmental research invested by U.S. companies resulted in approximately 2.5 patents. Since 2009, this figure has decreased to 1.5. In a 2017 analysis of the declining productivity of R&D investments, economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research examined a wide range of evidence from various industries, products, and firms, and reached the startling conclusion that research effort is rising substantially while research productivity is declining sharply. They analyzed research that covered economic data from the 1970s to the 2010s within the agricultural, pharmaceutical, and manufacturing industries, among both privately and publicly owned companies. They further suggested that research productivity falls in half every 13 years as ideas are getting harder and harder to find. Another recent economic study avers. Hang on. Okay. Avers. Another recent economic study avers that one reason for the decreased effectiveness of R&D investments is the reduced growth of the available pool of ideas from which researchers can develop new innovations. Its analysis of U.S. patent data from 1926 to 2009 produced two key findings. 1. The pool of ideas had stopped growing since the 1980s. 2. Newer patents are less likely to induce further patenting. In summary, for the average U.S. business, innovation is getting harder and more expensive. This makes U.S. businesses less likely to invest in innovation in the future. Trusting them to perform an activity which will become more expensive and produce fewer short-term gains over time is quite literally expecting them to do the opposite of what they exist to do. Oh, and by the way, since a lot of people still believe that small businesses can cover for this, nah. That's wrong. Most industries in the United States spend very little on R&D. 7 industries, aerospace, automobiles, electronics, medical devices, pharmaceutical, and software, support 70% of US business R&D. In 2016, the electronics sector accounted for almost a quarter of private R&D investments, followed by the pharmaceutical and software industries, each investing a sixth of total business investments. As of 2016, large firms accounted for 87% of R&D spending in the United States. This share has increased from 2006 because gross R&D investment by small firms only increased by 3% as compared to the 49% increase by large firms. Moreover, while small firms currently account for 49% of U.S. employment, they represent a mere 13% of business spending on R&D, while firms of more than 25,000 workers account for 36%. Likewise, small firms account for 18.8% of patents issued, while the largest firms account for 37.4%. Average R&D spending per worker decreases with company size, not controlling for industry, as firms with 5 to 99 workers spend around $790 per worker, while large firms with 500 or more workers spend around $3,370 per worker. So small businesses are not only ineffective at innovation, but they're getting worse at it over time. Perhaps part of that is because of how long the processes of innovation actually take. Although the Congressional Budget Office did make a request for more research to study this, they were comfortable enough with the amount of research available to make some broad predictions. The length of time over which federal R&D spending affects aggregate output in the economy depends on the stage of research being funded. Industry studies of pharmaceuticals have found that new drugs enter the market about 20 years after public investments in biomedical research, and about 12 years after targeted disease-specific research. In the absence of other evidence, CBO estimates that the macroeconomic effects of spending on basic R&D begin only after 20 years, and that it will take another 20 years to realize the full effect. For applied R&D, the effects are considered to begin sooner, starting after 10 years, but still taking another 20 years to realize their full macroeconomic impact. Development expenditures are expected to begin to have an impact about a year after they are made, and, like basic and applied research, are also anticipated to follow a 20-year path to their full effect. While this is a macroeconomic view, the results still expose a long and expensive path from basic research to a minimum viable commercial product. So, in summary, private sector research is typically left to the largest corporations within a small group of industries who are interested primarily in the far less valuable development stage of the process and are usually coaxed into R&D by public sector spending. These corporations are also often patent trolls who are willing to fight against innovation in order to secure their place in the market. And this makes any numbers about the amount of spending that companies perform on R&D dubious at best. This one was actually kind of interesting because the answer to it is really informative about how economies function and how some of these definitions are actually more fluid than many people might have realized. The gist of the argument goes that the private sector is technically less wasteful because it's bigger, so its waste is less of its activity by percentage. Nah. Okay, so first of all, we have to define waste, and that's kind of impossible. I can argue that it's wasteful for private companies to send all of their profits to the top through executive stock compensation, and I can hope that most people would agree with that. But some people legit believe that companies only exist to get oligarchs like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk paid. To them, that's not waste. It's social Darwinism. I cannot compellingly argue against that because it's simply a difference in values. I could literally show them how this model makes almost everyone on the planet's lives vastly worse, and they could just shrug and tell me that that's how the system works. And they can't really be wrong, but only because they also can't really be right. But they can be assholes. The second thing we would have to do is actually compare the private sector and the public sector. And that's kind of like if I brought you a baseball team and a basketball team and asked you, which one is better? Naturally, you might ask, well, better at what? And I could only reply, oh, just better. There's no real way to have any meaningful answer without trying to dive into specific metrics, but they're such fundamentally different institutions that their goals are completely separate from one another. If we talked about something smaller and more specific, like who's a better employer or who's better at innovation, then that's pretty answerable. But we're talking about waste, and waste is both broad and already undefinable. So I can only give you what my answer is and tell you why I chose to measure what I did in seeking out that answer. I think most of us basically get the underlying logic of how the private sector works. Companies want profit and seek profit. The public sector is more complicated. For one thing, they don't just seek out money, they literally print it. There are publicly owned state companies, but that's getting overly complicated, and I just want to go over the basics right now. When we talk about government waste, we are typically measuring how our tax money is spent. And that's a little odd because the state does not actually have to tax its citizens. Countries have done so for a variety of reasons over time, but in America, budgets are allocated and the money can come from activities like the sales of securities. Again, this gets kind of complicated, but just realize that while government spending and taxation are somewhat aligned, they don't really have to be. What taxation is really useful for is controlling inflation, also as a form of wealth distribution. Essentially, while taxes have existed for many reasons, even inside of the US, today they're mostly useful as a way to keep the real economy under control. Here's the amount of taxation per year, and here's the size of the real economy. And here's how much money the top 0.1% have estimated. Basically, the economy that you interact with, that you buy groceries in and pay rent in, is an artificial bubble kept in check by a variety of government controls. This is what libertarians don't really understand about the economy. In the real economy, money is useless unless it's being traded. And when it is being traded, it's not generating wealth. It's just exchanging it. It circles the bubble endlessly. But the profit motivation doesn't work because it eventually shifts the trade currency, our money, out of the real economy bubble and into the much larger bubble of hoarded wealth. Governments and companies like this system because it's steady and they're already on top. They know how much we can earn because they control our wages, and they know how much we can spend because they control our taxes. We can't generate enough wealth to escape, and we can't ever compete with the people at the top. But we are forced to contribute valuable labor to society or else become unemployed and, eventually, homeless. But we're still talking about waste here. Well, one way to compare that is to say that tax revenue is roughly similar to corporate profits, because in the ideal capitalist world, profits are actually being spent on upkeep, research, and other activities that benefit the company that earned them, rather than just being taken by the owners. And tax revenue, similarly, is spent on the citizens of a country. Assuming that these purely textbook definitions held true in reality, then tax revenue would be much larger than corporate profits, but also much, much less wastefully spent, as pointed out in my previous video. The thing is, I was being generous. I was using the most rigged numbers I could find. But if I'm being 100% honest, then I would say that government waste rarely exists because, again, money doesn't mean the same thing to a state which can print it at its leisure. On the other hand, the private sector is incredibly wasteful because it's constantly removing that money from the real economy. It's rendering it valueless. Now, I know that some people are tearing their hair out because I mentioned inflation before and haven't yet come back to it. And to them I say, oh, ye of little faith, of course I'm going to talk about inflation. After all, it's one of my least favorite fetishes. The case that most people probably think of is the hyperinflation of Germany after World War I, but I don't think that most people understand what happened there, really. It's not just that prices were raised or some tax policy gone amok. The Germans had to pay war reparations. They had to send their money to other countries to pay for all of the stuff that they had exploded. Anyways, a lot of the money they were printing was leaving their own real economy bubble and being shipped overseas. And that eventually devalued their currency, which is what actually caused that streak of hyperinflation. Now look at these bubbles again. If all of the people in the 0.1% were spending that money outside of the US, then what would happen to inflation? And why would they do that? Well, there are quite a few stocks, including value stocks, as well as leveraged loans and commodities, which can all become more profitable as inflation rises. And as inflation rises, national instability increases as well, which weakens whatever government is opposing corporate rule. What a waste indeed. Some people like to bring up the idea that, hey, aren't these all mixed economies anyhow? And that's a whole thing which I guess I have to get into now. So, if you're not aware, the basic definition is as follows. A mixed economic system is a system that combines aspects of both capitalism and socialism. All known historical and modern economies are examples of mixed economies. Both pure socialism and pure free markets represent theoretical constructs only. That's from Investopedia, and it's another textbook definition without any nuance or context. So, pretty much how most people come across this idea. The problem with this definition is twofold. One, capitalism and socialism are very new ideas. Declaring that they can only exist in these certain ways is remarkably short sighted. And two, this ignores why mixed economies exist. In capitalist countries, it's because they would collapse without socialism. In socialist countries, it's often because they want to increase their GDP. This was the goal in the Soviet Union, which was the second largest economy in the world before it messed around with capitalism and collapsed. That's obviously a shortened version, and there were a lot of reasons for the collapse overall, but the primary economic one was definitely capitalism. And if you don't believe me, then feel free to take a tour of Russia now and see what 30-ish years of supposed economic freedom has brought to them. China is an interesting case because they were more successful in their capitalist reforms, but income inequality is still rising there, as it does in any country that implements capitalism, and it remains to be seen how long they can last in their current model. Their attempt to jump into a service economy will be especially interesting to watch. I messed up on some math, probably because I'm no good at math. As a few helpful people pointed out, this should be a 12. Oops. Especially embarrassing during a section which I was blasting Roe for his own crappy math skills. But in my defense, and this is the internet, so I do feel like I have to defend myself a little, I'm one person with, as of the making of this video, fewer than 20,000 subscribers who just finally opened a Patreon. Mike Rowe is a millionaire working for billionaires, pushing an agenda that is anti-labor. I turned a 10 into a 12 on accident, and despite the fact that he could easily afford people to check his math for him, he made a much larger mistake. He also possibly made it intentionally. And as far as I know, he's never admitted to it like I'm admitting to my mistake now. I'm American. I cannot pronounce the names of cities that I have actually lived in. The Excel spreadsheet should be linked on the Capitalists Are Bad at Business video now. The source documents for that and the micro video are also there. Please check the video descriptions to find those. Anyways, my next video is going to be on the price of optics and political discourse. It'll be done when it's good. And if you are feeling generous and want to help me continue eating until then, feel free to head over to my Patreon page and engage with my internet panhandling, because I am not nearly confident enough to have an OnlyFans account.